What happens when a single act of prejudice on a flight changes everything? Imagine sitting quietly in first class, minding your own business only to be accused loudly, publicly humiliated, and treated like a criminal. This isn't just any passenger. This is the man who owns the entire airline. Yet, the flight attendant's assumptions blind her to the truth, setting off a chain reaction that will shatter her career and force her to confront the deepest biases within herself. Who is this man in the quiet gray tracksuit? What does it mean to be truly seen versus being judged by appearances? And can someone trapped in a lifetime of prejudice find redemption when the walls of privilege crumble? Set against the backdrop of luxury jets, and later the gritty reality of disaster relief in Haiti. This story challenges us to question our own assumptions, to recognize the power of grace, and to understand that true transformation often comes from the most unexpected places. Are you ready to witness a journey of humility, confrontation, and hope that unfolds 41,000 feet above ground and far beyond? If this story moves you, hit like, share with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more real stories that inspire and provoke thought. Let's dive in. At 38,000 feet, silence took on a different quality. It wasn't the absence of sound, but rather the presence of something softer, cushioned air, muffled footsteps, and the low hum of a jet slicing through sky. Inside the first-class cabin of Crosswind's Air Flight 417 Luxury, wrapped around its passengers like a tailored suit. Fresh espresso lingered in the air. Glasses shimmered under soft, amber cabin lighting. Leather seats molded perfectly to every curve of the body. This was not merely flying. This was curated serenity. Deborah Langley moved with effortless precision down the aisle, her uniform spotless, her smile rehearsed and professional. She had been with Crosswinds for 19 years. She took pride in her work, especially in first class, which she privately thought of as her kingdom. She knew who belonged up here. She knew the rhythm of this world, the pace, the tone, the polish. That's why, when she looked at Seat 3A, something inside her paused. He didn't fit. The man in 3A sat quietly, legs crossed, reading a paperback so worn the corners had turned soft and the spine was faded. He wore a gray track jacket, clean, simple, logo-free and black frame glasses that were more practical than stylish. His face was calm, his features composed. He hadn't asked for champagne or a pillow, not even water. He'd nodded politely when she greeted him, then simply settled into his seat and started reading. And yet, Deborah couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't that he was black, at least, not entirely. She told herself that wasn't it. She'd served celebrities, athletes, and entertainers before, many of them black. But this man wasn't famous. He had no entourage, no visible wealth, no watch that gleamed like an announcement. He hadn't even removed his shoes or reclined his seat. He was unassuming, too unassuming. His ticket, she remembered, had scanned fine at the gate, a digital check-in, J, cross, common enough. Still, something didn't sit right. She glanced around the cabin. In 1A sat Dr. Simone Thomason, traveling with her young son Eli. The boy had already tucked himself under a soft blanket, eyes glued to a tablet. Simone had introduced herself warmly when boarding, poised, gracious, confident. Across the aisle in 2D, a finance guy in a navy suit was already 2 bourbons in and snoring softly. And then there was 3A. Deborah lingered near the beverage station, her hands moving on autopilot as she restocked glasses. Her eyes kept flicking back to him. He turned a page in his book, slowly, thoughtfully. She tried to catch the title. It was Meditations Marcus Aurelius. Of course it was. Philosophers in tracksuits. Pretentious. She turned to her co-attendant, Naomi Vega, who was reviewing the dinner manifest on the tablet. Naomi was sharp, early 30s, always calm under pressure. Deborah leaned in, her voice low. "Have you interacted with 3A?" she asked casually. Naomi glanced up. "Mr. Cross. Just once. He asked where the restroom was. Polite guy. You think he looks out of place?" Naomi raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean? I don't know. Something's off. He's reading Aurelius and dressed like he's flying basic economy. Doesn't even want champagne." Naomi paused. Maybe he's just a quiet guy. Some people are like that. Deborah didn't reply. She couldn't explain it. It wasn't anything he said or did. It was what he didn't do. People in first class usually had a posture about them, a certainty, a silent way of saying, "I belong here." Mr. Cross didn't exude that. He wasn't shy, just self-contained. Too self-contained. Deborah moved back into the aisle, forcing a gracious smile. She approached 3A with a glass of Dom Perignon in one hand. "Mr. Cross," she said, her tone sweet, practiced. "Would you care for a glass of champagne? It's a 2008 vintage." He looked up slowly, his eyes soft brown, intelligent, met hers without hesitation. "No, thank you," he said gently. "Just water. Still, no ice if possible." There was something about the way he said it. Direct, without apology. It irritated her more than it should have. Most passengers would have stumbled, asked a question, shown hesitation. But he didn't. Still water, no ice, as if this cabin was his home and she was simply offering something he didn't need. She brought him the water, placing it on the small table beside his armrest. Her movements were crisp, her smile thinner now. She caught another glimpse of his book and couldn't help herself. "Interesting choice of reading," she said, gesturing. He looked at the cover, then back at her. "It's a good reminder to stay grounded," he said, "especially when you're 38,000 feet above the world." Deborah didn't reply. She forced another smile and moved on. Inside, something twisted. She told herself she was overthinking it, but the seed had already been planted. A quiet question looping in her mind like static. Who is this man, and why did she feel so unsettled? The cabin remained quiet, cradled in the soft hum of engines and the gentle, pressurized silence of the sky. First class had its rhythm, its unspoken codes. Deborah Langley had always been a master at reading those rhythms. She could tell when someone was nervous, newly wealthy, or simply pretending. But with 3A, it was different. There was no nervous fidgeting, no hungry eyes darting around, soaking in luxury like it might vanish. There was only stillness, calm. It unnerved her more than anything else could have. She returned to the galley, her heels clicking softly against the carpet. Naomi stood at the counter, now arranging the dinner trays with her usual quiet focus. Deborah poured herself a glass of sparkling water. Her throat was dry, her stomach tight. Naomi looked up, sensing her tension. "You okay?" Deborah took a sip before answering. "I don't know. That guy, Cross, there's just something." Naomi gave a gentle smile. "He's reading Marcus Aurelius and asked for still water. That's not a crime." Deborah's mouth tightened. No, but you've been on as many of these flights as I have. You know the type that usually sits up here?" Naomi paused. "I do. And I know not everyone who belongs here wears Rolexes or asks for caviar." Deborah bristled. "It's not about that. It's, look, don't you get a feeling sometimes like your gut just says something's not right?" Naomi didn't answer. She just looked at her for a long moment, then turned back to the trays. Deborah hated that look, like Naomi was measuring her. Back in the aisle, Deborah made her way slowly through the cabin. Dr. Thomason had dozed off with a book still open on her lap. Little Eli had pulled his blanket over his head, the glow of the tablet still illuminating the thin fabric. The finance guy in 2D had removed one shoe and was now mumbling in his sleep. 3A hadn't moved. He was still reading, still that same quiet presence, unbothered by the world spinning around him. Deborah paused near his row again. She smoothed her skirt, then stepped closer. "Mr. Cross, we'll be beginning dinner service shortly. Would you prefer the salmon or the short rib?" He looked up with those steady, unreadable eyes. "Neither. Thank you. I'm not eating tonight." Deborah forced a nod. "Very well. Let me know if you change your mind." He smiled politely, then returned to his book. That smile. It wasn't smug, wasn't mocking, but it burned under her skin all the same. It was as if he was humoring her, like he saw right through her performance, her hospitality. She turned away quickly. In the galley, she didn't say anything to Naomi. Instead, she scrolled through the manifest on the tablet. The name was there: Cross, Jalen, ticket confirmed, frequent flyer ID listed, all clean, too clean. She pulled up the reservation history. Ticket booked through a private agent, last-minute upgrade, but everything was official, nothing to challenge. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling. She leaned against the counter, staring down the aisle toward 3A. The man hadn't made a single unnecessary movement since boarding. Didn't chat, didn't scroll on a phone, didn't do anything to assert status. He simply existed. And for some reason, that irritated her more than anything. She remembered the last time someone flew first class and didn't belong there. It had been 5 years ago on a flight to Zurich. A man had slipped past the boarding gate during final call and sat in an empty seat left unassigned due to a last-minute cancellation. No ticket, no ID. It took hours and police involvement to sort it out. He had also been quiet, polite, just like this. She clicked the tablet off and took a slow breath. Was she imagining this? Or had 19 years of experience trained her to recognize something most others wouldn't? That was the thing about gut feelings. You couldn't prove them, but you also couldn't ignore them. Later, while Naomi handled drinks, Deborah slipped into the lavatory at the rear of the first-class cabin. She locked the door and leaned against the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her tight jaw. Careful makeup, slightly smudged mascara. Why was this bothering her so much? She told herself it wasn't personal. She wasn't trying to start something. She just needed to be sure. After freshening up, she returned to the front. Naomi had just finished serving coffee to Dr. Thomason. Deborah leaned in quietly. "Do me a favor," she whispered. "Next time you pass him, see if you can get a closer look at his bag. Maybe the tag, or anything unusual." Naomi looked up, frowning. "Why, I just want to confirm something." "You mean profile him?" Deborah stiffened. "I'm asking you to be observant." Naomi's voice stayed calm. "Deborah, he's not doing anything wrong. "That's what makes it worse," Deborah said, her voice low, sharp. "He's too perfect, too still. No one flies like that unless they're hiding something." Naomi didn't respond. She only stared for a long moment, then turned away. Back at her jump seat, Deborah stared ahead in silence. She replayed every moment boarding, the way he held his book, the subtle smile. None of it made sense. Why did this man, with no obvious wealth, no ego, no fuss, make her feel so deeply unsettled? It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something else, something deeper. Was it the control he had over himself, the way he didn't try to impress anyone, or was it that he didn't need to prove he belonged because in her world, everyone proved something? Through conversation, through labels, through demand, but not him, not Jalen Cross. He just was, and it shook her to the core. As the lights dimmed in the cabin and the hush of night flight settled in, Deborah sat in silence. But inside, her thoughts were a storm. There had to be something wrong with him. There had to be. Because if not, then maybe the only thing out of place wasn't the man in 3A. Maybe it was her, somewhere over Kansas. The sun began its slow descent. The cabin lights adjusted with it, gradually dimming to a soft, amber glow. It was the hour of hush when passengers dozed lightly. Pages turned slowly, and time slipped into that peculiar mid-flight stillness. Deborah Langley stood at the front of the cabin, one hand resting on the edge of the beverage cart, watching seat 3A through the narrow gap in the curtain. Jalen Cross hadn't moved for nearly an hour. He was still in that same position. Legs crossed, elbow resting on the armrest, thumb carefully pressing down the corner of a page as if time had no claim on him. That calm, that quiet, unshaken presence, it stirred something almost physical inside her. Deborah wasn't usually like this. She didn't obsess. She didn't chase shadows. But something about this man pushed against her sense of order like a pressure behind her eyes. She told herself she wasn't paranoid. She was being diligent, cautious, protective. That's what she always told herself. When Jalen rose from his seat and walked toward the lavatory, she straightened. He moved without hesitation, with a quiet dignity that made it all worse somehow, like he didn't owe anyone an explanation for existing, like the space around him automatically adjusted. Naomi stood nearby in the galley, cleaning up after dinner service. She caught Deborah's glance and raised an eyebrow. "He's just going to the restroom," her eyes seemed to say, but Deborah had made a decision. This was her chance. She waited until the lavatory door clicked shut, then walked quickly down the aisle. At seat 3A, she stopped, looked around. The rest of the cabin was half asleep. Dr. Thomason was reading under a blanket. The finance guy was out cold. Naomi had her back turned, fiddling with the espresso machine. Deborah bent down and reached beneath the seat. The bag was there, a black canvas carry-on, plain but well kept. No luxury brand, no tags boasting loyalty status. Just a simple, zippered pack with a single silver lock. She glanced over her shoulder once more. Then she pulled the bag out slowly and set it on the empty seat beside his. Her fingers hesitated. "It's just to check," she whispered to herself. "Just to be sure." She unzipped the main compartment. The contents were shockingly ordinary. A folded sweatshirt, a toiletry kit, a leather-bound notebook filled with handwritten lines, a worn business magazine, a box of granola bars. No cash, no documents, no passports, no red flags. But as she reached deeper, her fingers brushed something hard, cold, metallic. Her heart jumped. She closed her hand around it and pulled it free. A ring of keys, large, heavy, industrial. Attached to the ring was a silver tag, worn smooth with time, but the engraving was still legible. Fleet Access, Crosswinds Air, Master Set. She froze. Her pulse slammed in her ears. Fleet Access Master Set. She read the words again, this time mouthing them. No, that couldn't be. No passenger would carry this, no one except unless it was stolen. That had to be it. That made sense. He was posing, pretending. He had taken this from someone. Maybe hacked into a system, maybe forged a boarding pass using a real name. Her mind raced. What if he had bigger plans? What if he was using this flight to test something or someone? What if she was sitting at 38,000 feet with a potential hijacker? The thought made her grip the keys tighter. Just then, she heard a soft metallic click, the lavatory door. She snapped into motion. The keys went back into the bag, shaking fingers fumbling with the zipper. She shoved the bag back under the seat, stood up, adjusted her collar, and turned. And there he was. Jalen Cross stood calmly, his hands by his sides, watching her with that same unreadable stillness. His brow raised slightly, politely. Everything all right? Mrs. voice was soft, even, but now, with the blood rushing in her ears and the heat crawling up her neck, it sounded dangerous, not in tone, but in what it didn't say. Deborah's throat tightened. She smoothed the front of her uniform. "I was just making sure your bag was stowed properly," she said. He nodded once. Slowly. "Appreciate it." He returned to his seat, sat, opened his book again, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just committed a violation of personal privacy that could have gotten her fired. Her chest was tight. She walked back to the galley, every step louder than the last. Naomi was waiting there, arms crossed, gaze cool. You were in his bag. Deborah's breath hitched. Naomi didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You told me you had a gut feeling," she continued. "But what you just did, that's not intuition, that's fear." "I found keys," Deborah whispered. "Master keys. Crosswinds Fleet Access." What kind of normal passenger carries that? Naomi blinked. Maybe the kind who has permission. "He's lying," Deborah hissed. "He has to be. That bag is a cover. He's planned this." Naomi shook her head. "Or maybe he's not lying. Maybe you're the one who needs the lie to make sense." Deborah turned away. She felt unsteady. She had crossed a line. She knew it, but the knowledge didn't slow her pulse. It only hardened her resolve. Now she had seen proof. Now she had to act, because if she didn't, and something happened, it would be her fault. She looked down the aisle. Jalen sat in 3A, still reading, still calm, still wrong. She could feel it in her bones. And next time he stood, she was going to confront him directly. Let everyone see what she saw. She would protect the cabin, even if no one else understood. The aisle felt longer now, narrower, as if the air had thickened and was pressing in on all sides, the kind of pressure that builds slowly, then all at once. Deborah Langley stood near the galley entrance, arms crossed tightly over her chest, eyes fixed on seat 3A. Her mind was racing, but her expression was controlled. On the surface, she still looked like a seasoned first-class attendant, poised, composed, in charge. But inside, something was unraveling. She couldn't stop thinking about the keys, the weight of them, the engraving, the polished silver that caught the light just enough to feel sinister. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, watching Jalen. Minutes, seconds. She wasn't tracking time anymore. Naomi's voice came gently from behind her. "You're not seriously thinking of doing something, are you?" Deborah didn't turn around. "I'm thinking of protecting the flight," she said softly. From what Deborah didn't answer, she waited until Jalen closed his book and reached down slowly for his water. He took a sip, adjusted his glasses, and then stood. He stretched briefly, the kind of casual movement every passenger made to avoid stiffness. Then he started walking toward the rear of the cabin. Now. Deborah stepped into the aisle, heart pounding. She didn't speak at first. She simply moved into his path, blocking him, not aggressively, but firmly. Jalen looked at her, confused. "Excuse me," he said calmly. "I need you to return to your seat," Deborah replied. "Is something wrong?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You tell me." Jalen blinked, searching her face. "I don't understand." "No," she said, louder now. "You don't, but I think everyone else deserves to." Dr. Thomason stirred in her seat, lifting her eyes from her tablet. Her son Eli peeked over the armrest. The man in 2D looked up, confused and blinking. Naomi stepped into the aisle from the galley, her voice cautious. "Deborah," but Deborah was already speaking. "This man is not who he says he is," she announced to the cabin. Jalen remained still. "I found unauthorized keys in his bag, keys that grant access to our entire fleet," she continued, voice growing sharper. "He's carrying something no normal passenger should ever have." The cabin went still. Jalen's face didn't change. He didn't raise his voice or step back. He simply looked at her. "Are you accusing me of something I'm accusing you of lying about who you are?" Deborah snapped. "I think you used someone's credentials. I think you got on this flight under false pretenses. And I think you need to sit down until we land where the authorities can deal with you properly." Naomi stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Deborah, stop." But Deborah pressed on. "We have protocols for a reason," she said. "Passenger safety, company property. This man is in violation of both." Still, Jalen didn't react. No anger, no outrage, just silence. Dr. Thomason rose from her seat. "Is this really necessary?" she asked. Deborah didn't even look at her. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. I'm a physician, Dr. Thomason said, standing her ground. "And I've been watching this man all flight. He's done nothing wrong." Deborah turned, voice trembling now with fury. "You don't know what's in his bag. I saw what was in his eyes." Dr. Thomason replied, "And I know the difference between calm and dangerous." Naomi looked around the cabin, panic flashing behind her eyes. Deborah was unraveling, and everyone could see it. "You're all being fooled." Deborah barked. "He's pretending, hiding in plain sight. It's what they do." The words hung in the air like a slap. Naomi's face went pale. Even Deborah realized too late what she had said. Jalen took a slow breath. "I'm going back to my seat," he said quietly. But Deborah stepped in again, voice rising. "You are not going anywhere." Passengers gasped. "Security will meet us when we land," she continued. "I will make sure of it. You're not walking off this plane like nothing happened." "Ma'am," Jalen said, eyes calm but firmer now. "With respect, you're making a mistake." Deborah's voice cracked. "Don't you dare play that with me. You don't belong in this cabin. You don't belong here at all." The silence that followed was absolute. until a new voice entered the room, a low, authoritative baritone. "What the hell is going on out here?" Captain Ross Harlan stood just outside the cockpit, his expression stone-set, his gaze piercing. Deborah turned toward him in relief. "Captain, thank God. This man has been carrying unauthorized credential. He's a risk. He needs to be detained." Captain Harlan's eyes moved past her, toward Jalen. They widened slightly. Then something in his posture changed. His shoulders squared. His tone shifted. "Mr. Cross," he said, calm and deferential. "I didn't realize you were on this flight." Deborah froze. "What?" Captain Harlan nodded toward Jalen. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said to the stunned cabin, "please forgive the disturbance. There's been a misunderstanding." Deborah's voice was a whisper now. "You know him?" Jalen turned to face her fully. "My name is Jalen Cross," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I am the founder and CEO of Crosswinds Air, the airline you currently work for." It was said with no arrogance, no performance, just fact, raw and final. "Doctor." Thomason sat down, stunned. Naomi covered her mouth with one hand. The man in 2D straightened in his seat, visibly sobering. Deborah stumbled back a step. "No," she muttered. "No, that can't be." "You," Captain Harlan cut in, voice clipped. "Deborah, galley, now." She didn't move. He pointed toward the curtain. "That's an order." Deborah turned, her feet heavy. She didn't remember walking, only the weight of eyes, of silence, of the realization that everything, every instinct, every word, every decision had been a catastrophic miscalculation. Behind her, Jalen Cross remained standing. Still calm, still quiet, but now everyone knew exactly who he was. The galley curtain swung closed behind Deborah Langley with a soft swoosh, but the silence that remained in the cabin was anything but soft. It was thick, weighty, unforgiving. Jalen Cross remained standing in the aisle, his back straight, his chin lifted only slightly. He didn't need to assert anything anymore. His presence had already done that. Captain Ross Harlan exhaled a slow breath and turned toward the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "please rest assured. There is no security threat. We appreciate your patience. The flight will continue as scheduled." He gave Jalen a nod, one that spoke more like a soldier saluting a general than a captain acknowledging a CEO. Jalen returned it with a slight incline of his head. Then, without a word, he turned and walked slowly back to seat 3A. He adjusted the book on his tray table, sat down, folded his hands. It was the same movement as before, but now it felt different to everyone watching. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was the man who owned the sky they were flying through. Deborah sat in the galley, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She stared at the floor, her eyes unfocused. Her uniform, always crisp and sharp, now felt like it clung too tightly to her skin. Her heartbeat pulsed behind her ears. Her throat was raw from shouting. Her chest ached from the weight of her humiliation. Naomi entered slowly. She didn't speak at first, just stood there, watching her. Deborah finally lifted her head. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I had no idea who he was." Naomi's voice was quiet. "That's the problem. Deborah, you didn't care who he was. You decided he didn't belong before he even spoke." Deborah flinched. Her eyes brimmed with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Shame. Real, tangible shame. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "You thought you were protecting something," Naomi replied, softer now. But what you were protecting wasn't safety. It was your own idea of who belongs. Deborah covered her face with her hands. I ruined everything. Naomi sat down on the jump seat across from her. Maybe, maybe not. That's not for me to decide. Deborah looked up, her face pale, her lipstick faded. He was so calm, even when I accused him, even when I yelled in front of everyone. He didn't lose it. He just looked at me like I was already done. Naomi didn't answer. She didn't need to. Back in the cabin, Captain Harlan had returned to the cockpit. Dr. Simone Thomason leaned toward Jalen from across the aisle. "For what it's worth," she said gently, "I'm sorry you had to go through that." Jalen looked at her, eyes steady. It's not the first time. There was no anger in his voice, just resignation, and probably not the last. He added. She nodded. "Still, you handled it with more grace than I could have mustered." He gave a quiet smile. "Grace is a skill I've had to sharpen. Comes with flying while black." Simone's jaw tightened. Her hand instinctively reached for her son's head, resting gently on his curly hair as he slept. "Maybe one day my son won't have to sharpen it," she said. "Maybe," Jalen replied. The seatbelt light came on. The flight was beginning its slow descent into New York. Out the window, the last sliver of sunset painted the clouds in gold and lavender, as if the heavens themselves were trying to soften the sting of what had happened. In the galley, Deborah sat upright, wiping her face and straightening her collar. Her hands trembled as she gathered the dessert trays. A part of her wanted to disappear, to vanish between the walls of the aircraft and never be seen again. But she had made the mess, and she would finish the shift. She stepped back into the cabin, carefully placing dishes in front of the passengers. When she reached 3A, she hesitated, her eyes lowered, her hands unsteady. "I apologize, Mr. Cross," she said, voice barely audible. "I made a terrible mistake." He looked at her, held her gaze for just a moment too long, and then gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said simply. No speech, no scolding, just a thank you. Deborah walked away with her throat burning and her pride shattered into pieces she wasn't sure how to pick up. The wheels touched down 20 minutes later at Kennedy International Airport. A smooth landing, a silent cabin. The jet rolled gently to its gate as the passengers began gathering their belongings. Jalen remained seated until the others had exited. Captain Harlan stood at the doorway, waiting. "I want a word," he said as Deborah passed by. She nodded. Naomi lingered near the galley but didn't intervene. She just watched as Deborah walked forward like a student being summoned by the principal. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was tight. Harlan stood, arms crossed. "Do you realize what you've done?" Deborah didn't respond. "You screamed at the CEO of the airline. In front of first-class passengers, you accused him of theft, of deception. You created a panic, damaged the company's reputation, and humiliated yourself in the process." She opened her mouth, but he raised a hand. "Save it. You'll speak to him directly. He's waiting." Her chest tightened. "What you're meeting him in the terminal," Harlan said, "and you will listen." As the last of the luggage was removed and the cabin lights dimmed, Deborah walked down the ramp in silence. Her footsteps echoed through the private arrivals corridor. At the far end stood Jalen Cross. He wore the same track jacket, the same glasses. He wasn't flanked by security, no assistants, no PR team, just him. She stopped a few feet away. "Sir," she started, her voice shaken. He held up a hand gently. I'm not here to destroy you. Deborah. She looked up, startled. You could have fired me. I still can. She nodded. I would understand. But I'm not going to, he said. She stared. Why? Because firing you would be too easy. It would make you angry, make you a victim in your own story. But this, he paused. This is going to stay with you. Deborah's eyes welled. She bit her lip. I'm going to assign you to something new, he said. Her breath caught. You're going to spend the next few months with our outreach program, working on the ground. In communities where people like me are too often misjudged, you'll serve them, listen to them, learn from them. She was speechless, and maybe, just maybe, he added, you'll begin to understand what you couldn't see at 41,000 feet. He started to walk away, but paused. You've got one shot at making this right. Then he disappeared into the corridor, his footsteps vanishing into silence, and Deborah Langley, the woman who once ruled first class with an iron smile and perfect posture, stood alone at the gate with the weight of her mistake pressing down on her chest. It was the beginning of something, but she didn't know yet if it would be a reckoning or a redemption. The flight was over, but for Deborah Langley, it hadn't ended. She sat alone in the empty galley of the grounded plane. The cabin crew had already disembarked. The last of the passengers were long gone. Luggage compartments stood open, the hum of electronics muted. The scent of roasted nuts and espresso still hung in the air, but it no longer smelled luxurious. It was stale, cloying, like perfume clinging to an argument. The silence was not peaceful. It was punishing. Deborah leaned against the stainless steel counter, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The pristine galley that she once treated as her command post now felt like a box, a place too small for everything pressing in on her chest. She had never felt this way after a flight. Not after delays, not after turbulence, not even the time a drunk celebrity vomited into a crystal glass and tried to tip her with a watch. But this was different, because this time, it wasn't a crisis she managed. It was one she caused. The shame hit in waves, cold, hot, then cold again. She had always prided herself on professionalism, on keeping things in control, and yet she'd unraveled in front of an entire cabin. Worse, in front of her boss. No, her boss's boss. The man who owned the fleet, the company, the chair she sat on, and probably the tailored uniform she now felt too unworthy to wear. Jalen Cross had barely raised his voice. He didn't throw his title around or demand she be fired, but somehow that made it worse. He had given her the most excruciating gift of all, the chance to sit with her own reflection. Naomi returned quietly, her hair pulled into a bun now, her bag slung over one shoulder. She didn't say anything right away. She stood in the doorway of the galley and waited. Deborah didn't look up. You're still here, Naomi said softly. Deborah nodded. I didn't want to walk through the terminal. She whispered, not yet. Naomi stepped inside, setting her bag down. She pulled out a small bottle of water and handed it to Deborah, who took it without a word. Are you okay? Naomi asked. Deborah let out a sound half scoff, half breath. No, not really. Naomi leaned back against the wall. He gave you a chance, she said. That's more than most would have done. Deborah nodded, slowly. I know. Naomi watched her, expression unreadable. Why, she asked after a pause. Why him? Why did you lock on to him like that? Deborah closed her eyes. The answer wasn't simple, or maybe it was, but saying it out loud made it too real. I don't know. She said he was so calm, so composed, like he didn't need anything from anyone. He didn't act like the others in first class. He didn't perform for attention, and that bothered me. Naomi tilted her head. You mean it challenged you? Yes, Deborah whispered. He didn't fit my boxes, and I needed him to. She looked up, eyes glistening. I think I was afraid of what Deborah paused, then shook her head. I wish I knew. Naomi didn't speak for a while. Then, finally, maybe that's something you'll figure out in Baltimore. Deborah blinked. Naomi opened her phone and showed her an email from the scheduling system. The header read, Temporary Duty Assignment. Northwood Outreach Hub. Effective immediately, Naomi said, reading aloud. Assigned to Community Aviation Initiative, Ground-Based Outreach, reporting to Director Dante Mitchell. Deborah read the words twice before understanding them. She was being removed from flight duty, grounded, and sent to Baltimore. That's punishment, Deborah muttered. Naomi didn't answer, but it's deserved. Deborah added a moment later. The last vestiges of her pride cracked under the weight of that truth. Her voice trembled. I yelled at the owner of the airline, Naomi. I accused him of being a criminal. I said he didn't belong. And the worst part is, I believed it, even after I saw the keys. Even after he stayed so composed, I didn't stop. Naomi finally stepped closer, her voice steady but kind. I've worked with you a long time. I've seen you calm people during turbulence, help a mother when her baby spiked a fever mid-flight, de-escalate drunk businessmen without breaking a sweat. Deborah looked up at her, confused. You're better than what you did on that flight, Naomi said, but that doesn't excuse what happened. You made it worse. You let the worst part of you make the call. Deborah nodded, tears finally slipping from her eyes. I don't know how to fix it. Maybe fixing it isn't the point, Naomi said. Maybe the point is learning how not to do it again. They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, the sun had fully set. The airport lights glowed against the tarmac, casting long shadows against the fuselage. Deborah wiped her face. Baltimore, she said quietly. Yeah, Naomi replied. You'll be working under Dante Mitchell, former pilot. Gave up flying after he lost a brother to a botched traffic stop. Runs youth outreach now, especially for kids who've never been on a plane. Deborah swallowed. Sounds like someone who won't have much patience for me. Probably not, Naomi said with a small smile. But he'll teach you something. That I'm sure of. Deborah looked around the galley one last time. The stainless steel counters, the stacked glassware, the checklist taped to the drawer, her old world, her comfort zone, gone. She stood slowly, the stiffness in her knees reminding her how long she'd been sitting. You heading out? Naomi asked. Yeah. Want me to walk with you? Deborah hesitated. No, I think I need to do this part alone. Naomi nodded. She didn't try to stop her. As Deborah walked down the aisle for the last time in uniform, she passed 3A. The seat was empty now, just a folded blanket and a water cup left behind, a quiet echo of the storm that had happened midair. She stopped, rested a hand lightly on the headrest. I'm sorry, she whispered, not to the man. He was gone, but to the memory of him, to the version of herself that had stood there and judged him for being composed, for being black, for being powerful in a way she didn't understand. Then she stepped off the plane and into a future she hadn't asked for, but maybe needed. The cockpit was quiet. the kind of quiet that only arrived after a long flight and an even longer conversation that hadn't yet happened. Captain Ross Harlan sat in the co-pilot's chair, though the seat felt foreign now. His hands were folded in his lap, his eyes staring straight ahead at the instrument panel that no longer needed his attention. Beside him sat Jalen Cross, no longer the quiet man in 3A, now just himself, the man who'd owned the silence. Captain Harlan glanced over at him. Jalen didn't look tense or angry. He looked like someone who had carried the weight of these conversations before. Many times. "Mr. Cross," Harlan began, the words tasting awkward in his mouth. "Jalen is fine," he said without looking over. "Jalen." Harlan nodded. "Look, I want to start by saying, I'm sorry. I should have stepped in sooner." Jalen finally turned to him. His gaze was calm, but it wasn't soft. "You were listening, weren't you?" The captain didn't pretend otherwise. I was. From when Harlan exhaled slowly, around the time she started talking about the keys, Jalen nodded once. "So you knew what was happening, and you waited." "I did." Jalen didn't say anything for a few seconds. He let the weight of that choice linger in the air. Then he asked why the captain turned slightly in his chair, facing him, because I wanted to be sure I wasn't projecting. We've both seen what happens when authority overreacts, and I trusted you had it under control. Jalen's lips pressed together, not quite a smile, not quite a frown. I appreciate the honesty. Harlan sat back. It still wasn't right. I failed you, and I failed the passengers. That's on me. Jalen looked down at his hands, resting calmly on his knees. He ran a thumb slowly across his palm, thinking. "You know," he said, "I've flown with this company since day one. I've sat in this exact seat, met every crew member personally at some point. Not all of them remember me, and I don't expect them to, but I always hoped the ones who stayed this long would have understood what kind of company I was trying to build." "I think most do," Harlan said quickly. "Deborah, she was a blind spot." "She wasn't blind," Jalen said. "She saw exactly what she wanted to see, and nothing else." Harlan flinched. He nodded slowly. "She's been with us from the beginning, and I'll admit there were moments, complaints even, from junior staff, microaggressions, they said, the kind of things that don't show up in incident reports. We talked to her, but she always managed to stay professional until now." Jalen looked up, and that's exactly the problem. Harlan waited. "You gave her the benefit of the doubt," Jalen continued, "over and over. But when it came to me, she gave me nothing, not even a moment's grace." The cockpit went silent again. Outside, the soft buzz of equipment powering down hummed like a quiet apology. "I could fire her," Harlan offered. "We can process it tonight, finalize it before she even unpacks her bag." Jalen didn't answer. "Not yet. I've terminated people for less," the captain added. "That's why I'm not going to," Jalen said. Harlan turned, surprised. What Jalen leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice even. "If you fire her now, she becomes a victim in her own mind. She'll blame politics, wokeness. She'll rewrite the narrative in a way that lets her sleep at night." Harlan considered that. "You want to keep her flying," Jalen said. "She's grounded, but not fired. Then what I want her to see the people she judged, the ones she thought didn't belong in the seats she served. I want her to work beside them, serve them, listen to them, see what she's been blind to for 20 years. The captain blinked. "You're serious." "I'm not interested in vengeance," Jalen said. "I'm interested in transformation." Harlan let the words hang there. "That's risky," he finally said. "What if she resents it? What if she quits on day 3? "Then that's on her," Jalen replied. "But if she stays, maybe she comes back someone better." The captain looked out through the windshield, where the tarmac shimmered under pale floodlights. His mind drifted to the younger Deborah he once hired. Ambitious, detail-oriented, commanding, but, even then, she had been quick to decide who was worthy of attention, and quicker still to dismiss those who weren't. "She'll be reporting to Dante Mitchell," Jalen added. Harlan gave a low whistle. "She's in for a ride." "Good," Jalen said, standing now. He won't tolerate pretense. He paused at the door, turning back. "You know the funny thing." "What's that?" "Her instincts weren't entirely wrong. I wasn't who I appeared to be, just not in the way she imagined." Harlan nodded slowly. "She saw power and felt threatened. She saw blackness and felt suspicion," Jalen corrected. "And that's something no uniform can fix." Harlan stood as well, extending a hand. "I'm sorry again, Jalen, for what happened, for my part in it." Jalen took the hand. "Firm and brief, I appreciate that. But I didn't need an apology. I needed someone to act." He left without another word. Harlan remained in the cockpit, the silence heavier now. He looked around the space that had always been his sanctuary, the buttons, the switches, the familiar hum of systems winding down. Tonight, it all felt unfamiliar. He sat back in the captain's chair and stared into the dark, and wondered how many passengers he'd served in silence without ever really seeing them. Baltimore greeted Deborah Langley with wet sidewalks, a sky the color of pewter, and the sound of traffic that never quite stopped. The city pulsed with a kind of raw, unfiltered energy. It didn't wear polish like the inside of a luxury jet. It breathed realness, grit, movement. She had never felt more out of place. The Crosswinds Northwood Outreach Hub was tucked between an old community library and a nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated people rebuild their lives. Its facade was plain red brick, navy blue trim, and a metal sign bolted above the door with fading letters that read Crosswinds Youth and Aviation Pathways. Deborah hesitated before going inside. She adjusted the collar of her crisp uniform shirt out of habit, though she wasn't technically in uniform anymore. Her suitcase felt heavier than it should have, maybe because it carried the weight of not just clothes but consequence. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old books, printer paper, and cinnamon oatmeal. Kids' voices echoed faintly from a back room. There were posters of airplanes taped to the walls, some real, some clearly drawn by children with wide imaginations and broken crayons. One featured a Boeing 727 colored entirely purple, with hearts on the wings. Another showed a jet flying over a rainbow. Behind the front desk sat a woman in her 50s, hair streaked with silver, reading a clipboard. Deborah cleared her throat. "Hi, before she could finish. The woman looked up. "You're the one who yelled at the CEO?" Deborah froze. Her cheeks flushed instantly. The woman didn't smile, didn't offer a handshake. "I'm Teresa. Admin, you're reporting to Dante. He's in the back. Just follow the hallway, last door on the left." Deborah nodded, stunned into silence. She made her way down the hall, each footstep echoing more loudly than it should have. The walls here were thin. The truth moved quickly. At the end of the corridor, the last door stood open. Inside. Dante Mitchell sat at a battered desk with a chipped mug that read "World's Okayest Pilot" and a laptop that looked like it had survived a war. He was in his mid-40s, with broad shoulders, deep brown skin, and the kind of eyes that didn't miss much. There was a photo behind him, two young boys standing beside a tiny plane on a grassy airstrip. One was smiling. The other, a little older, had a hand on the younger one's shoulder. Dante looked up as Deborah entered. "So, you're the one," he said without standing. "I suppose I am," Deborah replied quietly. He stared at her a long moment, then gestured to the folding chair across from him. "Sit." She obeyed. "You know why you're here?" he asked. She nodded. "Tell me." Deborah's voice caught, but she forced it out. "I misjudged a passenger. I created a public confrontation. I embarrassed the airline, and I damaged trust." Dante tilted his head. "That's the version they sent you with. What's your version?" Deborah looked down. "I thought he didn't belong," she admitted, "because he didn't look like the others. And because I saw something in him that didn't fit the box I'd built in my head." Dante leaned back. "And what was that box made of?" She hesitated. "Assumptions," she whispered. "Fear, pride." He nodded. "Good, that's a start." Deborah looked up. "You're not going to yell at me." "No," Dante said. "I don't waste energy yelling. I save that for when kids run into traffic or forget to eat before they faint. You're not a child. You're not here to be punished." He stood and walked to the window, hands in his pockets. "You're here to see." "See what?" she asked. Dante turned to her. "Everything you've never had to look at. The neighborhoods the airlines don't fly over. The stories that don't show up on in-flight magazines. The kids who think the sky doesn't belong to them." He walked back to the desk. "You'll help run workshops, teach basic aviation, clean up messes, coordinate transportation, and listen. A lot." Deborah swallowed. "I don't know how to do any of that." "Good," he said. "You'll be easier to teach." There was a pause. Then Dante sat down again. "Orientation starts in 15. You'll be shadowing Carla and Micah today. They're both 21. One's a mechanical prodigy. The other just got his pilot's ground cert. They're the future. Try not to get in their way." He picked up his coffee mug. "And Langley," he added without looking up. "Yes." "Leave the flight attendant voice at the door. No one here cares how well you can pronounce Chardonnay." Deborah managed the smallest smile. "Understood." The day moved fast. Too fast for her to process anything beyond survival. Carla was a burst of energy in a NASA hoodie, leading a room full of high schoolers through a slideshow on aerodynamics. She explained lift and thrust like she was reciting poetry. Micah was quieter, intense, with hands constantly moving, fixing wiring on simulator equipment and showing kids how to calibrate wind sensors using a mix of patience and dry sarcasm. They barely looked at Deborah. They didn't need her, and that stung. By the afternoon, Deborah found herself standing beside a flight simulator while a shy 13-year-old girl named Layla nervously adjusted the throttle. "You want to fly commercial one day?" Deborah asked, trying to make conversation. Layla didn't look at her. "No, cargo. I like machines, not people." Deborah gave a soft chuckle. "I used to think I liked people, until I realized I only liked the ones who behaved the way I expected." Layla blinked at her. "That's dumb." Deborah grinned. "Yeah, it is." At the end of the day, Dante found her wiping down a whiteboard in one of the classrooms. "You made it through your first shift." Deborah turned, barely. "You'll get better. I don't know if I belong here." Dante crossed his arms. "You don't. Not yet. But you will, if you let yourself." Deborah nodded. "I want to." He studied her for a long moment. "You ever flown over Baltimore?" he asked. "Not below 10,000 feet. He pointed to a laminated map on the wall. "Tomorrow, we're going to the Westport hangar. Real planes, real kids, real talk." "I'll be there," she said. "I know," he replied. As she packed up her things, Deborah glanced once more at the map. The lines crisscrossed neighborhoods she had only ever seen as dots from the sky. But here, the dots had names, stories, dreams, failures, pride. Baltimore was no longer just a layover, it was the beginning of something. She didn't know yet what kind of redemption was waiting here, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to look for it. The Westport hangar sat at the edge of the airfield, weathered by salt, wind, and time. Its metal siding was streaked with rust, and the Crosswinds logo, once bright and proud, had faded into something ghost-like. But inside, the air buzzed with life. Deborah Langley stepped out of the van with a clipboard in one hand and uncertainty in the other. The morning was already warm. Kids in safety vests darted between equipment racks and engine parts, some carrying toolboxes, others scribbling notes on checklists that flapped in the breeze. A single-engine plane sat center stage like a patient on an open table, its belly exposed, its wings like arms waiting to be mended. Dante Mitchell walked ahead of her, dressed in jeans and a Northwood Outreach jacket. He didn't turn around when he spoke. This is where the magic happens, not the kind you see on red carpets, the kind that gets grease under your nails and builds futures one bolt at a time. Deborah nodded quietly. "I'll be shadowing Micah and Carla again?" she asked. Dante shook his head. "Today, you're with me." He led her toward the far end of the hangar, where a small office overlooked the bay. The glass windows were scratched, and one had a crack taped over with duct tape. Inside sat a teenage boy, no older than 16, hunched over a flight checklist. "That's Corey," Dante said. "He's prepping for his first assisted taxi run, one of our brightest. Used to skip school every other week. Now he's up at 6 every day just to sit in a cockpit that doesn't leave the ground." Deborah peered through the glass. The boy's face was focused, jaw tight, brows furrowed in concentration. "He looks serious," she murmured. "He is," Dante said. "He knows exactly what's at stake." A bell rang through the hangar, 2 short chimes. It signaled a team transition. Dante turned to Deborah. "You're with the red team this morning. You'll be helping prep a mock pre-flight checklist with 3 students. I want you to read it like it matters." "It does matter," she said, almost defensively. "Then let them hear that in your voice," Dante replied, walking away. By 10:00 a.m., Deborah stood next to a Piper Cherokee with 3 teens in front of her. One wore oversized headphones around his neck, another chewed gum loudly, the third, a soft-spoken girl named Bree, held a checklist tighter than necessary, as if afraid it might fly away. Deborah took a breath. "Today, we're reviewing what pilots and crew walk through before any aircraft moves. Every bolt, every pressure gauge, every latch, it all matters. It's not just safety, it's respect for the machine, the sky, and the people you're responsible for." Her voice surprised even herself. She hadn't meant to sound so certain, but it came out clean. Solid. Bree raised a hand. Did you used to fly? Deborah shook her head. I was a flight attendant, first class mostly. The girl looked impressed. Deborah paused, then added, and sometimes I forgot that flying meant more than warm towels and champagne. The boy with the headphones smirked. You giving a TED talk? Deborah didn't flinch. No, just a woman trying to fix something. He raised his brows, caught off guard. She smiled gently. Let's start with the landing gear. Lunch was held outside, on fold-out tables shaded by a ragged canopy. The kids laughed, passed around sandwiches, and traded energy bars like currency. Dante sat with Deborah near the corner of the lot, a paper cup of black coffee in his hands. You didn't suck, he said between sips. Deborah let out a small laugh. High praise. You held their attention. That's worth something. I think Bree is going to be a pilot, Deborah said. She looks at those wings like they're freedom. They are freedom, Dante said. For kids who've never left the ground, flight is possibility made visible. Deborah stared out across the tarmac. A private jet passed in the distance, gliding like a ghost across the runway. Do you think they'll ever make it that far? She asked. Dante didn't hesitate. Some will, some won't, but all of them will believe it's possible. And that's more than most of them had before. Deborah nodded slowly. I used to think I loved flying, she said, but now I realize I loved control, the service, the Polish. I didn't understand flight. Dante looked over at her. You're beginning to... She looked at him. What about you? You gave it up. Why? He was quiet for a moment. My brother, he said eventually. He was shot during a routine traffic stop. We were supposed to open a charter company together. He never made it. I kept flying after he died, but it didn't feel the same. I needed to do something grounded, something that gave the sky back to kids like him. Deborah didn't know what to say. I'm sorry, she whispered. Dante nodded. I'm not telling you for sympathy, just context. You're walking through a space people bled to create, so walk carefully. She swallowed the lump in her throat. I understand. He stood, tossing his empty cup. Let's see if Corey's ready. In the afternoon, they walked Corey to the taxi strip. The boy's nerves were obvious. He adjusted his sleeves 3 times, checked the checklist twice. His sneakers tapped restlessly against the asphalt. You good? Dante asked. Yeah, Corey said, voice tight. I think. Dante clapped him on the shoulder. You've trained for this. Trust yourself. The plane won't leave the ground, but your mind might. Corey nodded and climbed into the cockpit with the mentor beside him. Deborah and Dante stood just outside the hangar, watching the propeller spin to life. You ever sit in the left seat? Dante asked. Once, Deborah said, for a photo op. It didn't feel real. Maybe it wasn't, he said. But this is... They watched as Corey slowly moved the plane along the line, wheels bumping gently along the painted path. A few kids clapped. Bree beamed. The boy with the headphones gave a reluctant thumbs up. And for a moment, Deborah felt something rise in her chest. It wasn't guilt or shame or even redemption. It was hope, raw, unfiltered, unpolished. She didn't know if she'd earned it yet, but she wanted to. And that, maybe, was enough for now. It started with a tremor, not in the ground, but in the air, in the silence that filled the Northwood Outreach Hub just after noon. Teresa, the front desk admin, leaned away from her computer and muttered a quiet, "Oh no." that rippled into the hallway like a warning. By the time Deborah passed the common area, the flat screen on the wall had switched from kids' aviation videos to a live news feed. An earthquake, magnitude 7.2, off the coast of Haiti, aftershocks, downed towers, hospitals collapsing, children missing, families displaced. Then came the footage, aerial shots of crumbled buildings, gray dust clouds swallowing up villages, people with nothing scrambling through debris, carrying the wounded in their arms, no power, no water, and no time. Volunteers from the outreach center gathered around the screen, jaws tight, eyes wide. Deborah stood behind them, her hand against the doorway, heart sinking. By the time Dante returned from a meeting across the street, phones were already buzzing. Teresa waved him down. Crosswinds just called. She said, "They're mobilizing. Jalen's leading a multi-airline response." Dante nodded once, then turned to the crowd. "Everyone," he said, voice calm but firm. "We're about to become part of something bigger." The students quieted. Bree clutched the handle of the simulator's door. Micah's fingers stopped moving over a circuit board. Even Corey, who was usually too cool to flinch, set down his checklist. Dante walked to the center of the room. Crosswinds is preparing humanitarian flights, supplies, doctors, first responders. They'll need staff, fast. We're not being asked to fly, but we may be asked to help organize ground support, coordinate logistics, build supply kits. This is why we exist. He looked across the room. This is what aviation was meant for. An hour later, Deborah stood with Dante in his office. The door closed behind them with a soft click. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Just overwhelmed. That's normal." Deborah ran a hand through her hair. "Jalen called me," Dante said suddenly. Deborah blinked. Me. He pulled out his phone and slid it across the desk. A voicemail played. Jalen's voice came through, calm and clear. "Dante, I'm on my way to the operations hangar now. We're activating all regional bases. We'll need everyone. I trust you to send who's ready. If Deborah is part of that list, I leave that call to you." Dante hit pause. Deborah stared at the phone, stunned. "He still wants me," she whispered. Dante shrugged. "He trusts people to rise after falling. That's rare." Deborah swallowed. "I haven't been on a plane since the incident." "This isn't a luxury flight," Dante said. "This is a supply run into chaos. No passengers, no service carts, just pallets, cargo nets, and people who need help. You'd be assisting logistics, loading, inventory, basic coordination." She hesitated. "Do you think I'm ready?" Dante walked to the window, looking out at the hangar. "I think you know why you want to say yes. That's enough." That night, Deborah didn't sleep. She lay in her small apartment 2 blocks from the center, the ceiling fan above her spinning slowly. Her mind wasn't racing the way it used to after flights or long shifts. It was quiet, focused, still filled with uncertainty, but no longer paralyzed by it. The image of the collapsed buildings wouldn't leave her, nor would the look on Corey's face when he asked if planes could carry medicine as well as passengers. She hadn't known how to answer, but now she did. She rose before dawn, packed lightly, left a handwritten note for Bree, telling her she'd be back in a few days and to keep practicing her pre-flight checks. And by 6:15 a.m., she was at the airfield, waiting. The operations hangar looked nothing like the one she had trained in. This one was chaos layered on top of purpose. Forklifts beeped in every direction. Pallets stacked with medical supplies stood in lines like chess pieces waiting to move. Men and women in cargo vests barked coordinates and loaded crates like it was second nature. Jalen Cross stood at the far end, clipboard in hand, headset around his neck. He wore no suit, no tie, just a black Crosswinds flight vest, gray tee, and worn boots. He moved with the urgency of someone who understood what every second meant. When Deborah approached, he looked up and gave her a nod. "You came?" "Yes," she said simply. He handed her a list. "You'll be riding jump seat with Flight 4C, cargo aid bound for Cap Haitian. Wheels up in 3 hours. You'll help with onboard logistics. There's a ground crew waiting to unload on arrival. You'll be eyes and ears from this side." Deborah looked down at the list. It was covered in codes, weights, and airport acronyms. "I'll do my best," she said. "I know you will," Jalen replied. She paused. "Thank you for not giving up on me." He didn't smile, just nodded once. "I didn't give up. I recalculated." The cargo bay of Flight 4C was nothing like the cabins Deborah knew. No windows, no recliners, just a steel cavern filled with crates labeled water, antibiotics, IV bags, family tents. The smell of industrial lubricant clung to every inch. The only seating was a thin jump seat folded into the side wall, across from an insulated cooler marked blood units. Deborah strapped herself in and waited. As the engines roared to life, a quiet calm settled over her. This wasn't about service, or status, or who belonged where. This was about movement, response, humanity. For the first time in her life, she was flying not to escape something, but to deliver something that mattered. As the wheels lifted off the tarmac and the sky swallowed the plane whole, Deborah closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "This is flight." The plane descended through thick, gray clouds, the rumble of the engine steady against the hum of tension that filled the cargo bay. Deborah Langley sat rigid in the jump seat, eyes fixed on the shadowy horizon visible through the cockpit's small windows. The landscape below was scarred patchworks of earth torn open, roofs missing, roads choked with debris. This was no longer the glossy world she'd known. No pristine leather seats, no gentle clinks of fine china, no curated silence. This was raw, real, unforgiving. Jalen Cross sat beside the pilot, quiet but alert. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with a purpose Deborah hadn't seen before. She thought back to the faces at Northwood, the kids learning to fly planes they might never board, dreaming of skies they'd never touch. This was their world brought painfully to life. The plane touched down on a battered runway, the tires kicking up dust and loose gravel. Emergency vehicles waited alongside workers clad in reflective vests and dusty boots. Deborah's heart hammered with urgency. The cargo doors opened, and crates stamped with red crosses and bold letters marked medical supplies began to roll onto waiting trucks. She stepped off the plane into a humid wind that carried the scent of salt, smoke, and desperation. The relief camp sprawled before her, rows of tents patched together with tarps. Children clustered near makeshift clinics, adults moving with a mix of exhaustion and determination. Doctors in scrubs tended to the wounded beneath shifting shade. Volunteers unloaded water, food, and medicine with practiced care. Dante Mitchell greeted her with a firm handshake and a nod. "Welcome to Cap Haitian," he said. "This is where the real work begins." Deborah swallowed the lump in her throat. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. She woke before dawn to organize supply lines, learned to assemble water purification kits, helped distribute meals, and spent long hours listening to stories of loss and hope, resilience and despair. One afternoon, Deborah found herself sitting beside a young mother named Amara, who clutched a sleeping baby wrapped in a faded blanket. Amara's eyes, tired but fierce, met Deborah's with unspoken strength. "This storm took everything," Amara said softly, "but we still have each other." Deborah nodded, feeling tears prick the corners of her eyes. She realized this was the humanity she'd missed in the cabin, the lives behind the luxury, the stories beyond the boarding pass. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the camp, Deborah stood at the edge of a clearing, watching children play soccer with a battered ball. Their laughter was raw and honest, a stark contrast to the polished smiles she'd served on planes. For the first time, Deborah felt something inside her shift, not just guilt or regret, but a deep, aching empathy, a connection she hadn't thought possible. She thought of Jalen, the man who'd quietly given her this chance not as punishment, but as an opportunity to see, to understand, to change. One day, while coordinating the delivery of medical supplies, she crossed paths with Dante. He smiled knowingly. "You're different," he said. Deborah smiled back, though it was tinged with weariness. "I am trying to be." Dante nodded. "Good, because change is hard, but necessary." The days blended into one another. The relentless pace, the ceaseless need, wore on Deborah's body and soul. Yet, with every exhausted smile, every whispered thanks, she found a piece of herself she never knew was missing. Her old world of first class and fastidious order felt like a distant dream. Here, in the dust and the sweat, she found a raw, unvarnished truth. Flight wasn't about escape or status. It was about connection, responsibility, service, and she would carry that lesson with her, no matter where she went next. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Caribbean horizon as Deborah Langley settled into the jump seat aboard Flight 7F, the Crosswinds Air Relief mission heading back to Baltimore. The sky was a wash of soft pastels, pinks, and oranges blending into the lingering night. It was a quiet moment, a breath held between what had been and what was to come. Her hands rested lightly on her lap. The steady hum of the engines filled the space, but inside, her thoughts were anything but quiet. She thought of the weeks behind her, the dust-filled air, the worn faces of the people she'd met, the raw, relentless need that had been impossible to ignore, the mother holding her child beneath a torn tarp, the children chasing a battered soccer ball with unbridled laughter, the steady hands of doctors working by candlelight. Those images had etched themselves into her soul. And then she thought of the man who had given her this second chance. Jalen Cross, the quiet CEO with the unassuming demeanor who had owned the fleet and yet moved through the world as if power were a whisper rather than a roar. His patience, his vision, his unwavering belief that transformation was possible not just for her, but for the company, the community, and maybe even the world. Deborah's eyes closed briefly. She'd come so far from the polished halls of private jets and whispered luxury. Her uniform, once a symbol of status, had been replaced by worn cargo pants and simple shirts. Her world had expanded beyond the narrow confines of first-class cabins and curated smiles. Now, she understood that flying wasn't about privilege or appearances. It was about connection bridging worlds, carrying hope, and lifting others higher than themselves. The cabin lights dimmed further as other passengers settled into their seats. The crew moved quietly, preparing for the long flight home. Deborah glanced out the window, watching the endless blue stretch beneath the wingtip. A gentle hand on her shoulder made her turn. Dante Mitchell stood there, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. Ready for the next chapter, he asked. Deborah nodded, her voice steady. "I think I am." They shared a look, an unspoken acknowledgement of the journey they'd both taken, the hardships faced, the lessons learned, and the hope that still flickered bright despite it all. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Deborah felt a calm settle over her, a sense of peace she hadn't known she was searching for. The sky outside was vast and open, a canvas for possibility. She pulled out a small notebook from her bag, the same kind she had seen in Jalen's possession months ago. She opened it and began to write. Not flight logs or service reports, but reflections, stories, promises to herself to carry forward what she had learned, to never forget the people who had changed her, and to always see beyond the surface. The hum of the engines grew steady and sure, and Deborah Langley, once a flight attendant who had screamed accusations at a man in first class, was now someone who understood the true meaning of flight. Not escape, not status, but grace and redemption. This story is more than a dramatic encounter on a private jet. It's a mirror held up to all of us, showing how quick judgments and hidden biases can destroy lives and careers. But it's also a powerful reminder that change is possible when courage meets compassion. Deborah Langley's journey from suspicion to humility, from anger to empathy, teaches us that redemption isn't about punishment, but about opening our eyes and hearts to the humanity in others. And Jalen Cross's quiet strength shows that true leadership is measured not by power, but by the grace to forgive and to inspire growth. We must never forget the cost of prejudice or the strength it takes to break free from it. Together, we can build a world where everyone is truly seen and valued. If this story touched you, please like this video, share it with friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge, uplift, and change perspectives. Thank you for watching. Stay with us for more journeys that shine a light on the courage it takes to rise above.